So this is the section on what criteria should be used. So one of the most important things an analyst has to do is to figure out ultimately how to evaluate the alternatives and what criteria to use for evaluating them. How do you do that? What do you think about?
Well, let me clarify one point before I get into that, which is we don't evaluate alternatives directly. We do it indirectly by looking at how the alternative could produce this, that, and the other outcome, and then we evaluate the possible outcome. So there's a step in there. But to get back to
And that's an important step, because sometimes people can think that they've got to evaluate the alternatives, but it really is what affects the alternatives produce that you want to evaluate to make sure that you understand what their real impacts will be and figure out whether those impacts are going to be bad or good.
Exactly. So there's a step here, and a lot of uncertainty resides in that step, which you have to be aware of. But to go back to the choice of criteria, it's interesting. I've rubbed shoulders with economists enough so that they've sold me on the idea that, quote, efficiency in the economic sense is a central criterion for almost every problem. Now, by efficiency, they don't mean, and I don't mean, counting paper clips. What they mean is the whole macro view of resources in the society are out there. How should they move around till they hit an agent that can use them more productively to produce, and it gives more utility if you look at just the consumption side. So that's what we mean by efficiency. I won't say more about it. It should be read about in a book, in an economics textbook.
Well, I'm just going to interpose, though, a thought or two, because there's at least two kinds of efficiency, and they're both really important. One is that you've got a goal you want to attain and trying to do it at least cost. That is to say, most effectively or efficiently. And that's typically if you've got a production process in a firm or in a government agency, you want to make sure you do that. But the second thing you want to do is think about making sure that you allocate resources most effectively. So that might mean that in fact you've got a process that's quite efficient for what it's trying to do, but you decide that really, in fact, from a societal perspective, you don't want to put your resources into that efficient, but nevertheless maybe wrong-headed pursuit, and instead move them to another area because in fact you could do something better. So an example would be, maybe you don't want to put a lot of money into prisons, even though they're efficient and effective prisons and they're doing what you think prisons should do, but it turns out to reduce crime, which is your ultimate goal, it's better to take that money, move it away from prisons and into community policing, and that will give you a better ultimate outcome.
Right. You're raising the difference between cost effectiveness and benefit cost. I mean, cost effectiveness is fine. If you committed to spending a certain amount of money, how should you do it most effectively? Okay. Or if you have a target, what's the least cost way of getting it?
So build the prisons at the least cost to be as effective as you want them to be in terms of housing inmates and doing the best job of doing that. But that's cost effectiveness. But benefit cost is saying, should we build the prisons at all?
Right. So efficiency covers both kinds of issues. But leave that aside. Let's move on to the economist's term equity. You could mean a lot of different things by that. What is often meant, and our students, this is their usage, it just means do something nice for poor people. That's fine.
Well, and it's important.
It's important.
And we do want to have a just society.
You want to have, but you can think about equity in other dimensions as well, but we won't go into that. Efficiency, equity, and then there's a whole bunch of things that can't be easily cataloged. Justice, to the extent that it's different from equity, which it is. Sometimes, it's very personal and partisan even, certain kinds of family structure that people like or don't like, or neighborhood strength. This whole set of issues comes up when you think about the problem of criteria.
Yeah. So you make a distinction between evaluative and practical criteria. What's that distinction all about?
Well, evaluative criteria is really about value. what do we value?
Evaluative, yeah. Okay.
Evaluate.
Yeah.
What do we value? Do we
Yeah.
value efficiency? We should. Do we value equity? We should, et cetera, et cetera. But then there's the practical stuff. Just about anything you do using instrumentalities of government has to pass through certain forms. Has to be legal, has to have, it's legislative and statutory, has to have a majority vote behind it, a signature by the chief executive. Implementation has to have a recognition of what bureaucracies can do, can't do, will screw up, will do well. Relationship between this organization and these NGOs out there in the community, all that's practical. So that you've got to think about both. Usually, I'd say there's a linguistic trick you can use. Usually, you want to maximize the stuff of value, the evaluative criteria. Usually, we use the semantic trick of saying, let's maximize blank, blank, blank. Will do you fine. But that's not going to help you with the practical stuff. You just need to suffice. You need enough legality for it to be legal, enough votes to pass, enough implementability to get it done. So that's one way to look at it.
That's great, yeah. So that's the end of the evaluative and practical criteria section, and we're about to go on to the next one.